and welcome back to Pedder Unplugged. This is the podcast where people from all walks of life share their stories about visiting the original Lake Pedder in the heart of Tasmania's southwest wilderness before it was flooded in 1972 for the creation of a hydro storage lake. I'm Tabatha Badger. When you look at photographs of the original Lake Pedder, there are a few magnificent things that take your eye, whether it's the brooding Frankland Range towering over the lake, or perhaps it's the magnificent mega ripples that lap the southern shore in that definitive herringbone pattern, the tannin-stained waters. Or maybe it's the aircraft that have landed on the beach. In 1947, Lloyd Jones from the Southern Tasmanian Aero Club became the first person to use Pedder's vast beach as a landing strip. Consequently, afterwards, Pedder became more accessible for bushwalkers, but also for civil industrial people who were surveying the southwest for its possible extractive purposes. My guest today is Stuart Lester, and he's a pilot who landed on Pedder's beach just before it was declared a national park. Stuart candidly shares what it was like flying back in the early days, before planes were equipped with a myriad of safety equipment. He learned to fly in a Tiger Moth. In fact, at one stage, he flew the very aircraft that activist Brenda Hean and pilot Max Price disappeared in on a flight to Canberra, where they intended to write Save Lake Pedder over the capital. As an experienced bushwalker, Stuart does a fantastic job of eloquently explaining how it felt to be on Pedder before visitation took off with the news of the flooding. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. This chat is certainly one of my all-time favourites. So here's our latest episode of Pedder Unplugged with Stuart Lester.
When I turned 18 years of age, in that period, it was compulsory for 18-year-olds to do military service. We were given a choice of joining the Army, Navy, or Air Force. And I chose Air Force, which meant I needed to go to Laverton in Victoria, just a bit out of Melbourne, where there was quite a large Air Force base, about 1,000 permanent Air Force people there. They drew 18-year-olds from Victoria, South Australia and Tasmania. We Tasmanians arrived in the camp along with all these other young fellows, and we were immediately put out on the parade ground and divided up into flights of, I'll say, about 24, I think, with a very noisy colonel in charge. And one of the first questions he asked the group was, are there any Tasmanians in my group? And myself and a chap from Launceston put our hands up. So this fellow in charge was let out a groan and said, just my bad luck. So you can imagine what Tasmanians, what our reputation was. So it went on from there. We did a lot of what was called square bashing, carrying rifles and doing drill. And we got a message that the Air Force was to train about a dozen young pilots from this group, and I hopefully put my hand up and managed to be selected. to learn to fly. So the 12 of us then, we moved into an exclusive little building where we learned the theory of flight, why the air rushes over the wings and causes lift, all those sort of things. And we were taught to fly the Tiger Moth. The Air Force had a contract with the Royal Victorian Aero Club, and every morning, if the weather was fine enough to fly, 3 Tiger Moths with their instructors would fly over from Moorabbin, land at Laverton, and that's how we learned to fly over a period of about 4 months. And we were taught to what then was private pilot's license, which meant we had 50 hours of experience in the Tiger, and that allowed us to take up a passenger. So we actually got a commercial license, a little book with photographs in the front, and a clause which allowed us to fly the Tiger Moth and take passengers.
That's extraordinary. In a Tiger Moth, and the only thing I know about Tiger Moths is from the Max Price and Brenda Hean story, but the passenger normally sits in the front. Is that right?
Yes, that's pretty right. They built thousands of them in England at a Hamilton company, and they were the basic trainer to learn to join the Air Force. That's where you started on the Tiger Moth. And they were a very responsive little aircraft, a little bit touchy to fly because they were affected by the wind greatly, particularly even on the ground. They were hard to handle because of the biplane and the big windsurfers. But I do think if you could, once you'd learned to fly on a Tiger Moth, you'd be able to fly just about anything.
That little flight license logbook that you were talking about, is that the same one that you have today?
That one, that is the logbook that I had. The license was a small document. I think we all have a car license now on a card, but they hadn't thought of cards at that stage. So it was a little booklet about twice the size of the card. The logbook is a record of all the flights that you've taken.
Ah, I see. You must have been one of the first pilots to fly into Lake Pedder and land on the beach. Lloyd Jones was the very first in the mid-1940s, but it was not long after. Was it 1955 that you first went in?
Yes, I've got it here. It was 55, yes, 26th of March. Yes, interesting. I was asked by one David Burberry, who was a cousin of mine, and he was a return pilot from the Second World War who'd taken up a farm at Kingston, south of Hobart, cattle. He was running cattle, and he'd been told by someone to have a look at the button grass plains south of Hobart, where he could probably run his cattle in the summertime. So David asked me if we could fly, and At that stage, yes, one could land at Lake Pedder, which we did. But I think once we got back, David then appreciated that it really wasn't practical. He'd be driving his cattle through all this wild, rugged country, and the idea was dropped.
Yeah, that sounds very sensible. What a place to try and get cattle into. That's amazing. It was considered. What sort of plane did you go in, and what was it like landing on the beach for the very first time?
Well, I was a bit apprehensive. If you look, there are some quite good aerial photographs of the old lake, and if you look, you can see a stripy pattern running in the north-south direction. It looks like a series of channels in the water. But once you get down at low level, you can see that's more or less just coloration. I'm not sure the reason for it, but the channels are barely noticeable, very shallow. And above that stripy pattern, the hard-white sand is great to land on, much firmer than the average beach that we see on our coastline.
And of course, the beach at Lake Pedder is a lot bigger than people realise. So it wouldn't have been quite a hassle or anything trying to take off to or land around the Franklands or the Coronets Range, because the beach was quite expansive, wasn't it?
Yes, you didn't have to worry about lining up on a narrow runway. There was heaps of room to land, and the beach was framed by a range of mountains. And I seem to remember one particular mountain, Mount Solitary, was something you could pick up from quite a distance away before you even saw the beach. Mount Solitary was an aiming point. By the time I'd flown in the air, quite a few planes had gone in, but the one I flew in was not the Tiger, it was an Osterregler, a three-seater, and much more comfortable, really, and easier to manage than the old Tiger because you had brakes on the front wheels to make sure you could stop the plane, and you also had a tail wheel compared to just the skid on the old Tiger. So they were a comfortable little aircraft to fly and did a lot of work in southern Tasmania.
Yeah, it sounds a lot more comfortable than a Tiger Moth, that's for sure. And you made 2 trips into Lake Pedder?
Yes, well, I would have loved to have done more, but I didn't have a long time at the Aero Club because in 1956 I returned home to our farm at Oaklands and started to do quite a bit more work than play, and eventually married in 1962. So once I was married, the flying had to take second place. So I really only had 6 or 7 years at the Aero Club, but still a time that I still well remember.
And when you flew the very Tiger Moth that Max Price had, when was that? Was that prior to moving back to Oatlands and being a responsible married man, or was that closer to when they embarked on that trip to Canberra?
I would say it's exactly the same aircraft. I've got it here in my diary, AQL, and I flew it on May the 8th, 1955, doing aerobatics, really, with a chap called Bill Johns. He was a part-time instructor at the Aero Club. Bill Johns was a bit of a character. He was the timpanist, or the drummer, for the Tasmanian Symphony Orchestra. And he and I did some aerobatics in AQL. But yes, they were good times. Before one was married, we would do our flying out at the Aero Club at Cambridge. And then on the way back to Hobart, it was a mandatory stop at the Wagon and Horses Hotel, which I think the same hotel is still there, and one would have the odd beer and recount the day's flying.
Absolutely necessary compulsory stop to do that. But Bill wasn't the only character down at the Aero Club. Max Price had a bit of a reputation as well. Hey, how did you come to meet Max?
Well, then again, Tabatha, I don't remember Max in my 7 years at the Aero Club. I have spoken, in fact, just a few days ago, I spoke to a chap who did a lot of flying there, knew Max well, and straight away he said, well, he was a real risk taker, wasn't he? And he also described seeing Max Price in the hangar at Cambridge with a carburettor taken out of the Tiger Moth, and he was fiddling around with the carburettor. Well, of course, that was illegal because it was only a licensed aircraft mechanic that was allowed to work on the engines. So that's only second-hand. I did not know Max Price personally.
So much of the stories you hear are consistent with him doing his own thing, not necessarily following the regulations. Do you remember much from the day that the Tiger Moth took off from Cambridge, September the 8th, 1972, or reading about it in the media afterwards?
Well, one of the first things I did, I realised that was the exact date. I went back to my farming diaries. At that time, we had left the farm at Oatlands and gone out on our own. The farm at Runnymede in the south, and I kept a careful diary of the weather. And that particular date in September 1972, the 3 days from the 8th, 9th, 10th were good, fine, ideal for flying weather. But I think it was on the 12th, I've actually got the diary here. Just look at the 12th. Yes, a very cold westerly change came in, and usually the Tiger Moth, it was not a bad weather aircraft. My guess would be if there was going to be an accident with a tiger, it would probably be weather related.
Sometimes people hypothesize that perhaps the fuel tanks were accidentally rejigged. So when flying over Bass Strait and they went to change to the reserve fuel tank, it could have accidentally gone to the oil tank or something similar to those circumstances. In your experiences with tiger moths, does that sound plausible?
I guess he may have had an auxiliary fuel tank fitted. And don't hold me on this, but the Tiger didn't have a very big fuel tank, and our range, I would think, would be perhaps 120 miles would be about the range on the original fuel tank. Whether max price there probably would be a record of him fitting an extra fuel tank, which would have led to complications, I suppose. But it certainly is a mystery if the aircraft did crash in the water. It would initially leave evidence, there'd be floating evidence. I think people I've spoken to would be more likely that it crashed in heavily timbered country. And I think there are records of aircraft crashing in heavily timbered country and not being discovered for years later. But I'm afraid it still remains a mystery.
Extraordinary that 50 years down the track, we still don't know precisely what happened. Back to flying into Lake Pedder, how did that feel compared to flying around other destinations? Some people, particularly bushwalkers, talk a lot about the natural beauty of Pedder and how it is so outstanding in comparison to so many of the other wonderful, magnificent wild places in Tasmania. Was it the same view from a pilot's perspective?
Well, getting there, I must have I felt quite nervous because one leaves Cambridge and takes a direct route just almost not quite over the top of our mountain, just a bit south of the top of Mount Wellington. And the view ahead then is just one mountain after another. And one singles out Mount Anne, which is a very prominent mountain. I didn't feel uneasy. The Oster had two fuel tanks. It had a belly tank and then a wing tank. And one was supposed to use the belly tank right till it was empty and the motor stopped. And then you immediately switched to the wing tank. But I wasn't going to run the belly tank right out and stop the motor. Looking at the view below me, I thought, what if that motor doesn't start again? So that was my first impression. And then flying just south of Mount Anne, but above the level of the peak of Mount Anne, there is a beautiful glacial lake on the northern side, I think, of the mountain. I remember the name, I think it's Lake Judd.
That's right, yeah.
Those beautiful lakes, we have so many of them. which I've walked into some of them. But then once one sees Pedder, of course, it's a totally different type of lake. Again, I think of glacial origin, but different. I believe the glacier dammed up a river and the lake formed that way. But of course, once you see and you know, in fact, as well as David Herbury, the other chap with me, had been to Lake Pedder, and he was able to give me confidence to land on the lake, and the landing part and the approach was quite simple, really.
Did you have to swap fuel tanks midway through?
No, well, I switched on to the wing tank, knowing that there was plenty in that particular tank, and probably the belly tank still might have had 20 minutes flying in it, but I didn't want to test it. No,
Fair enough.
One impression I got was, and you might appreciate this, that really, in a way, that we shouldn't have been there. There were signs where people had tents, and I don't think anybody had left any rubbish, but I think there was another plane there. And I did get this feeling, perhaps we don't really belong here. Can you understand that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating that that's how you felt. Was it as though you were intruding with, I don't know, I guess mechanical access of the plane, or that people didn't belong there in general, that this was a natural?
I think one does get that feeling with quite a bit of the bushwalking I've done in the south, that it's a bit too good to be spoilt. I guess we can go in there on foot, and yes, going in on foot and making the effort to get there is probably a bit different feeling again to going in a machine and sort of settling in with the camp and being a bit permanent.
It goes back to that age-old view that wild places need to exist for their own, just onto themselves. They don't need justification. Unless you've been there personally and experienced what you have in understanding, that some places have a really great presence and feeling and welcomeness about them. A lot of people can't appreciate that until they've experienced it themselves. And some people compare walking into Lake Pedder and that feeling that they got when they arrived at the beach and spent time there to other wild places, particularly along the South Coast track. Is there anywhere else that you've bushwalked in southwest Tasmania that has come close to compare to that feeling that you got when you were at Lake Pedder?
Oh, certainly. I think some people mightn't agree, but the walk to the Harts Mountains, and one can go past a beautiful little glacial tarn at the foot of the Harts Mountains. That's a beautiful spot, and the Harts itself, I think possibly part of the fascination of that is you get such a wide view of the whole of the southwest. Quite a lot of bushwalking. We do our bushwalking group. We love the southern forests and at the National Park, Medina. But very often there we're in rainforest or bush. That's a different feeling. But the Harts Mountain, and of course another one, we take a trip away from that area, Windlass Bay and the Freycinet region. are magnificent wild places.
I lived on the East Coast, and I remember the day when we were allowed to re-enter the national parks after they'd been closed down because of the pandemic. My friend and I were the first people into the national park, and it was so eerie. I've never been to Freycinet when it had been so quiet. We were the only two people there. There wasn't the noise of traffic or lots of other people. It was perfectly quiet. There was an echoing chorus of birds that was bouncing off the mountain range, and you could hear Wineglass Bay and the waves crashing long before you got to the saddle where the lookout is there. I imagine that sort of seclusion and solitude would have been similar to what Lake Pedder would have been back in the 1950s before visitation picked up and there was more human visitors in the area. So I can, yeah, definitely appreciate how you must have felt on a smaller scale though.
Yes, it's quite unique. Uh, and the little old Tiger Moth played quite a part because Lloyd Jones, who was the chief instructor of the Aero Club, while I was a member there, Lloyd played a big part in photographing and helping bushwalkers to open up and publicise the southwest. He was really the first to fly in that area, and quite a bit of it would have been, I think, in the little old Tiger, and rather tragic that he had a bad accident after all the flying he'd done during the war and round the south of Tasmania. Lloyd had an accident. You might know when I say a go-kart was sort of a glorified motor mower, and he was rather playful, Lloyd. He was playing, doing circuits with a go-kart on a bad day when they couldn't fly, and he crashed into the hangar door and badly injured himself. That was a real tragedy.
Yeah, all the stunts and pioneering he did in a plane for
Yeah,
that to happen. I think I read about that story in the book about Patricia Giles, who was a secretary for Lloyd and one of the Sunday painters who worked with Max Angus and spent a lot of time doing art at Lake Pedder. Did you ever meet Patricia Giles?
yes, we knew Patricia. I knew her father. I think we still own one of her paintings, yes, but no, she and Lloyd would have, I'd forgotten that she actually worked as his secretary, but they would have been a good pair in their love of the southwest of Tasmania.
Extraordinary, both of them in their own right.
As far as flying's concerned, I did make an attempt. I gave up my licence in 1962, and in 1992, that's 30 years later, once I'd retired from work, I thought, well, maybe I might just take up flying again. Conditions for obtaining a licence had been relaxed. All one needed to do was prove you were medically fit. And I did a test with a GP, which I passed, and I started at the same Aero Club. This was 30 years later. And I did 4 or 5 trips with the instructor, and he said, right, he said, you're ready to go home and think about it, which I did. I went home and thought, And, well, it is hard to turn your life backwards. And I thought maybe it would be better if I thought of some other hobby and just rely on the memories from flight. So I did make that decision. So one never loses one's interest in, the theory of flying and the progress that's been made over the years since I first learned to fly in a primitive but very popular little plane virtually made out of wood and fabric.
Quite extraordinary, and something that you should look back on very fondly, and that's a really tough decision to have made. Do you mind if I ask, what was the substitute hobby that you took up?
Mainly messing about with boats.
Oh yeah, still mechanical then.
Yes, it is, but no, a chance to explore the coastline and photography too. I mean, we are so fortunate now with this technology. One can carry a little mobile phone out and it will take brilliant photos and videos. And again, we don't have much excuse to be bored with our lives now. There's so many things to do. If I was 18 years old again, or I would advise a young person of that age now to join a bushwalking group and to explore all the parts of Tasmania that are quite easily accessible. And I think it's a wonderful way to exercise your body and your mind.
Well, that was Pedder Unplugged with pilot Stuart Lester. Thank you so much to Stuart for sharing his story. I've got to be honest, I think it's my all-time favourite. You're probably wondering, what would happen with a restored Lake Pedder if we deboarded the impoundment and revealed the beautiful quartzite beach once again? Would it simply become a tourist attraction, overrun with more planes ruining the World Heritage Area? Well, I wondered the same thing, so I contacted the local flight operator for Southwest Tasmania, and we discussed the logistics, safety, and also the financing of contemporary flying. It's been 50 years since you could land on Pedder's beach. Imagine trying to pull that off now, shuffling all the bushwalkers out of the way. Safely? It's simply just not possible. But the other main change are the finances. It's incredibly costly now to run planes into remote areas. Fuel is going through the roof, just as it is for cars. And look, the main comment from the flight operator was, why would you do it? That would ruin the wilderness serenity of the area that makes it so unique. If you're going to restore this beautiful gem, do it properly. That is some incredibly responsible custodianship right there. If you'd like to learn more about the possibility of restoring Lake Pedder, or the original Lake Pedder in general, visit lakepedder.org. I'm Tabatha Badger, and thanks again for listening.